On a quiet, typical morning, the old man shuffled down the busy street, his worn-out shoes scraping against the pavement. He carried with him nothing but a sack, clutched tightly in his hands. It was the kind of sack you would expect to see in the hands of a beggar or someone down on their luck. But there was something about him, something that didn't fit with the world around him. His every step seemed deliberate, calculated, like he had a purpose. The bank was a grand building, towering over the smaller, older structures around it. Glass windows reflected the busy streets and the hustle of city life. People moved quickly, wrapped up in their own problems, hardly noticing the frail man making his way toward the entrance. Inside, the hum of activity filled the air. Bankers, dressed in their polished suits, answered calls, greeted clients, and processed transactions. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That is, until the old man walked in. The doors swung open, and all eyes turned toward him. His clothes were ragged, his face covered in deep wrinkles, and his hands shook as he gripped the sack. He didn't seem to notice the stares. He simply walked up to the counter where a young teller was busy typing away. "I need to speak to the manager," the old man said, his voice rough but clear. The teller looked up, a mix of confusion and amusement crossing his face. "Sir, I can help you. What seems to be the problem?" he asked, glancing at the old man's sack, clearly not taking him seriously. "I need to speak to the manager," the old man repeated, his eyes locking onto the teller's with an intensity that made the young man pause for a moment. It wasn't the kind of gaze you expected from someone like him. There was something knowing about it. The teller smiled, assuming the man was confused or had mistaken the bank for somewhere else. He reached for the intercom to call for the manager, but paused when the old man suddenly added, "I own this bank." The words hit the teller like a slap in the face. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Excuse me?" he said, raising an eyebrow. The old man's face remained unchanged, his eyes sharp despite his appearance. "I said, I own this bank," he repeated, his voice steady. "I've come to take back what's mine." For a moment there was silence. The teller glanced at the other employees nearby, but no one said anything. The few customers in the bank had started to look over, sensing something was happening. The teller was about to laugh it off, but something stopped him. Was this some sort of joke? With a sigh, the teller leaned over the counter, trying to make light of the situation. "Sir, I think you're confused," he said, still smiling. "This bank has been here for over 50 years. I'm sure you're not the owner." The old man didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the teller, unblinking. "I don't think you understand," he said slowly, his voice lowering. "I own this bank. It was given to me by my ancestors, and I'm here to claim it back." The teller's smile began to fade, his amusement turning to confusion. He glanced around the bank nervously, wondering if anyone else had heard what the old man had said. One of the other bank employees overheard and began to chuckle, walking toward the counter with a dismissive look. "Hey, you're not fooling anyone," the younger employee said. "What, are you going to show us your inheritance papers or something?" The old man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached down and slowly, carefully unzipped the sack he had been clutching so tightly. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if everyone was waiting for some kind of strange reveal. The sack was large, old, and tattered, but there was no telling what could be inside. The teller watched, unsure whether he should step back or just continue to play along. The other bank employees gathered nearby, exchanging curious glances. Was this an act? A prank? With a slow, deliberate motion, the old man pulled out a heavy, worn ledger. It was thick, bound in old leather and covered in dust. He placed it gently on the counter, its weight shifting the air in the room. The sound of the book hitting the counter was like a small explosion, and all the laughter in the bank suddenly stopped. The old man's face was unreadable. "This is the original ledger," the man said, his voice quiet but forceful. "It holds the true history of this bank." The young teller stared at the book, his confusion growing deeper. "What do you mean?" he asked, What is this? Without a word, the old man opened the ledger, revealing pages filled with intricate, handwritten records. They were ancient, faded, but the writing was clear. It was the story of how this bank had been founded, its early transactions, and the names of those who had created it. As the man flipped through the pages, the room grew deathly silent. One by one, the employees gathered around, their curiosity now outweighing their skepticism. The old man turned the pages slowly, carefully, until he reached a particular page. He pointed to it. "This is where your ancestors signed their agreement to transfer ownership of this bank to mine," he said, his finger resting on the ancient document. The names were barely visible, but there, at the bottom, was a signature that made the teller's heart race. The name was old, but it was unmistakable. The room was completely still now. No one spoke. The manager had entered and was watching, from a distance, his face growing pale as he saw the ledger. The old man's calm, unwavering presence suddenly made everyone question everything they knew. The bank they thought they owned might not be theirs at all. The bank's grand lobby fell silent as the old man's finger hovered over the ledger, and all eyes were fixed on the ancient pages. The young teller was still in disbelief, his mind racing to piece together what was happening. He looked up at his colleagues, and then back at the old man, who had not even flinched when the room's energy shifted. Everyone seemed to feel the weight of the moment, yet no one dared to speak. What is this?" the teller stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. This isn't real." But the old man only met his gaze with unwavering calm, like a person who had seen countless storms but had never been moved by them. "It's real," he replied softly. "This bank is mine. It has always been mine. You don't know what you have or where you came from." A murmur spread through the employees, and the skeptical bank manager, who had been standing near the back, finally stepped forward. He had been watching this exchange, but now his patience was wearing thin. The old man's claim was preposterous, surely nothing more than a confused individual trying to cause a scene. He had seen plenty of strange situations in his years managing this bank, but this was beyond anything he had ever dealt with. "I'm sorry, but this is absurd," the manager said with a sharp tone, his eyes narrowing. "You must be mistaken, old man. This bank has been in operation for decades, and I've seen every file and document on the ownership. There's no mention of your name or your family anywhere. We've been running this place for over 50 years without issue." He glanced at the young teller, who was still holding the ledger like it was some kind of joke, unsure of what to make of it. The manager took the book from the teller's hands, flipping through the pages, his face twisted in skepticism. "Look here," the manager said, pointing to the signatures on one of the pages. "There's no mention of this name anywhere. This is a piece of history, but it's irrelevant. We own this bank now. This is nothing more than an old ledger that has no real value." The old man's face remained expressionless, but his eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity. He had anticipated this. He had expected them to laugh, to dismiss him as a fool, but they hadn't seen what he had seen. They hadn't lived the life he had lived. The weight of the ledger, the deep connection he had to the bank's legacy, it wasn't something that could be ignored so easily. "I didn't come here to beg for anything," the old man said, his voice soft yet strong. "I came here to claim what is rightfully mine." The manager waved a hand dismissively, eager to shut this absurdity down. "I think it's time you leave, sir," he said, the fake politeness dripping from his words. "There's nothing here for you." But the old man didn't move. Instead, he stood tall, his eyes fixed firmly on the manager's face. "You think you know everything?" he said quietly, his voice tinged with both sadness and wisdom. "But you don't. This bank was built on the sweat and blood of my ancestors. It's in the bones of this building. It's in the very air you breathe." The room was tense now, with the bank employees shifting uncomfortably. Some were beginning to look at each other nervously, while others tried to keep their focus on their work. But the old man's words carried a weight that none of them could ignore. The manager, too, was starting to feel the stirrings of doubt. Was it possible? Was there any truth to what the old man was saying? Before he could say another word, the old man reached into the sack once more, The manager froze, his heart skipping a beat. What else could be inside that sack? What was he going to pull out now? The tension in the room was almost unbearable. With slow, deliberate movements, the old man pulled out a small, weathered envelope. He opened it carefully, revealing a faded photograph. The photograph was old, so old, in fact, that the edges had yellowed and curled. But it was unmistakable. The image showed the very bank they stood in, but in a much different time. The structure was smaller, humbler, and in the corner of the photo, a younger man stood proudly. The old man's father. "Look at this," the old man said, holding the photo up for the manager to see. "This is the founding of this bank. My father built it with his hands. He signed the agreement you're dismissing so easily." The manager took a step back, his face flushing with embarrassment. He didn't want to believe it. He had been so sure of his own knowledge, so confident that his ownership of the bank was unquestionable. But now, doubt had crept into his thoughts. This photograph, this history, it couldn't just be ignored. The employees were watching now, their curiosity overtaking their skepticism. One of them whispered to another, "Could it be true?" But the manager quickly hushed them, not wanting to show weakness in front of the others. "This doesn't change anything," the manager said, his voice now more defensive than before. "The records are what matter, not some old photo. And this doesn't prove anything." But the old man wasn't finished. "I have more," he said calmly, "and when you see it, you will understand." The room seemed to close in on itself as the old man held the photograph up, his hands steady despite the growing tension. The once confident bank manager now stood frozen, the weight of the moment sinking in. The photograph told a story that was impossible to ignore. There in black and white was the very foundation of this institution, a place he had thought was built by the hands of men like him, and yet it seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The old man's eyes never left the manager's face. "You don't believe me yet," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. "But you will. You will, because the truth always comes out." The manager finally looked away from the photograph, his mind racing, desperate to regain control of the situation. He couldn't let this old man take away what he had worked so hard for. The bank was his. He had inherited it, had made it thrive. There was no way some tattered photograph could change that. Yet the photo lingered in his mind, each second twisting the knife of doubt deeper. "Look, I'm not saying I believe you," the manager said, his voice tight. "But one photo and some old records don't mean anything. This is a business. We've built this place up from nothing." The old man didn't respond immediately. He simply took the photo and placed it carefully back inside the envelope. The soft rustle of paper seemed louder than it was, and the bank employees were now gathered around, watching in silence. The teller who had initially laughed was the first to speak up, his voice uncertain. "Is he serious?" he whispered to his colleague. "Is this some kind of prank?" The old man raised an eyebrow at the young teller as if he had heard the question. "Do you think this is a joke?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Do you think this is something to laugh at?" The tension in the room became palpable. The manager, feeling cornered, tried to dismiss the situation once more. "This isn't going anywhere. I'm calling security," he said, his tone cold and dismissive. But there was a crack in his confidence now. He was unsure, and it showed. Before he could reach for the phone, the old man moved again. He unzipped the sack and pulled out a thick stack of documents, tattered, yellowed, but undeniably real. "You want proof?" he asked, his voice ringing through the room. "You want to see the truth?" The room fell into a stunned silence. The employees, once confident that they had control, now seemed hesitant. They exchanged uncertain glances, each of them feeling the discomfort of being caught in a situation they didn't understand. The manager's hand hovered over the phone, but he didn't call. Not yet. The old man opened the first page of the document and laid it out on the counter. It was an old contract, signed by men who were no longer alive, men whose names were barely legible. The ink had faded, But the meaning was clear. The contract was the original agreement between his ancestors and the first owners of the land. The agreement detailed the ownership and rights, and the signatures at the bottom confirmed it. This was the foundation of the bank itself. The old man tapped the document. These are the real founders. My family's name is here, and here. He pointed to the faded names where it all began. The manager's hand dropped from the phone, his face growing pale. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. This can't be real. But the documents didn't lie. The manager stepped closer, his eyes scanning the faded signatures, the official stamps, the original terms of the agreement. The evidence was undeniable. The old man smiled slightly. You see now, he said. I didn't come to fight you. I came to remind you of something you've forgotten. This bank doesn't belong to you. It never has. The employees, once skeptical, were now captivated by the truth unfolding before them. The quiet power of the old man was undeniable. They had laughed at him, dismissed him as nothing more than a fool. But now they were standing witness to history, to something that no one could have anticipated. What are you going to do? One of the employees finally asked, his voice filled with awe. What happens now? The old man turned his gaze to the young teller who had been laughing at him earlier. Now, you see who owns this place. You see the truth. A hush fell over the room as the realization set in. The old man wasn't just some crazy person who had wandered in from the street. He was the rightful heir to a legacy that had been buried under layers of time and neglect. The bank manager, his pride now shattered, took a step back, his mind racing. This isn't possible, he muttered, almost as if speaking to himself. How did this happen? How could we have missed this? The old man's voice cut through the chaos. You were too busy building your empire, too busy making money to care about the people who came before you. You thought your ownership was secure, but you forgot the history that built this place. The manager clenched his fists. He had never felt so powerless in his life. All the years of hard work, all the plans he had made to expand, to grow the bank, it was all based on a lie. The foundation of everything he had built was crumbling beneath him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The old man turned toward the door, his movements slow but deliberate. He had come here for one purpose, and now it was complete. The sack, his claim, the ledger, the photographs, all of it had led to this moment. And now, with the truth laid bare, there was nothing left to say. As he walked toward the exit, the once confident manager stood rooted to the spot, staring at the documents with a look of pure disbelief. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to rebuild it. The bank manager stood frozen in place, staring at the documents the old man had left behind. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him, and he felt a cold sweat begin to form on his brow. His once proud and solid foundation was now nothing more than a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. I can't believe this, the manager muttered under his breath, as if saying the words aloud might make them less real. This doesn't make sense. The old man had already turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps steady and unhurried, as if he had already won. His every move spoke of a deep, unshakable confidence, a confidence that the bank's leaders were clearly lacking now. But the manager wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. Not in front of his employees, and certainly not in front of this old man who had somehow upended everything he thought he knew. No, the manager said, suddenly raising his voice. This isn't over. You don't just come in here with a few old papers and walk away with this bank. The old man paused but didn't turn around. His hand rested on the door, his back still to the room. You don't get it, do you? He asked, his voice soft yet filled with a quiet power. You think your money and status mean anything now? You've lost what really matters. You've lost everything. The manager stormed forward, his pride taking over. I don't care who your ancestors were, he snapped. I'm the one who's been running this place. I'm the one who built this bank into what it is today. But the old man was calm, unfazed by the manager's outburst. You didn't build it. You inherited it. You've forgotten the blood, the sacrifice, the legacy that built this bank from the ground up. You've become so consumed by your wealth and position that you can't even see the truth anymore." The words hit the manager like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to lash out, but he couldn't. The truth was there, staring him in. The face, the evidence, the documents, the photographs, all of it was undeniable, and yet he refused to accept it. "I'm not going down without a fight," the manager said, his voice growing sharper, more desperate. "I'll take this to the courts. I'll hire the best lawyers. I'll prove you're lying. You can't just come in here and claim ownership of a bank. It's impossible." The old man finally turned, his gaze locking with the manager's. "You can try," he said, his voice low but firm. "But you can't fight history. You can't fight what's rightfully mine. The truth will always come to light." The manager's face flushed with anger. He turned to the employees standing in the room, all of them now watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. "You all know what's at stake here. This bank isn't just any business. It's a cornerstone of our community. We can't just let it go. We can't let him take it from us." But the employees weren't convinced anymore. One by one, their eyes began to shift, moving from the manager to the old man, as if they too were starting to understand that the truth might be on the other side of the argument. The teller who had first laughed at the old man now stood with a look of shame on his face. The other employees exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly conflicted. "No one here is saying we just hand over the keys," one of the employees finally spoke up. "But the documents, the history, maybe we've been blind to something. Maybe we should at least listen." The manager's jaw tightened, his fists clenching in frustration. "You can't be serious," he growled. "You think this man has any right to take what's ours after all we've built?" But as he spoke, something inside him cracked. The anger, the denial. It wasn't enough to silence the nagging voice in his mind that kept telling him he had been wrong all along. The truth was right there, in front of him. But he was determined to cling to the life he had built, no matter the cost. "Call security," the manager barked, his voice shaking with the force of his desperation. "I'm not letting this man get away with this. He's a fraud." The old man didn't flinch. He simply turned back toward the door. "Do what you must," he said calmly. "But understand this. It won't change the truth. And when the dust settles, you'll be the one who's left with nothing." He stepped outside, leaving the bank in stunned silence. The manager's face twisted in frustration, his eyes filled with the searing heat of a man who refuses to let go of power. Inside, the employees gathered around, their whispered conversations growing louder. They were beginning to understand something that had been hidden from them for so long. The manager, the leader they had trusted, was not the man they thought he was. The bank had been built on the foundation of the old man's family, not on the shoulders of those who now claimed ownership. No matter how hard the manager fought, no matter how many lawyers he called, this truth couldn't be erased. But it wasn't just about ownership, it was about the lesson that had unfolded before them. The manager's pride had blinded him to the importance of legacy, of family, and of history. And now he was going to lose everything because he refused to see the truth when it was laid out before him. The hours following the old man's departure felt like an eternity. The once bustling bank now seemed eerily quiet, the hum of phones and keyboards replaced by a tense stillness that filled every corner of the building. The employees had scattered, some returning to their workstations while others huddled in small groups whispering in hushed voices, still grappling with the revelations they had just witnessed. The manager, however, was a different story. He paced back and forth in his office, his hands trembling as he clenched and unclenched them. His mind raced trying to come up with a plan, anything that could prevent this from becoming a public spectacle. He had called his lawyers, and they were already preparing for a battle. But deep down something gnawed at him. The truth was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how much he fought, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. His phone rang, the harsh sound breaking the silence of his office. He snatched it up, his voice already filled with anger. "What's the update?" he demanded. On the other end of the line, his lawyer's voice was tentative, cautious. "Sir, we've looked through the documents, the history, and I'm afraid there's no easy way to deny it. The old man's claims are valid, the papers, the photographs, it all checks out. His family really did have ownership of the bank, and it looks like it was transferred without anyone noticing. The manager's face went pale, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. What are you saying? He whispered, disbelief creeping into his voice. I'm saying that the bank's history is being rewritten, the lawyer replied. We have a case, but the evidence is stacked against us. This is going to be a long and difficult fight, but he's right, and we can't ignore it. The manager slammed the phone down, his pulse racing. This couldn't be happening. How could it be happening? The old man's quiet confidence, his calm demeanor, it had all been a mask for the truth that no one wanted to face. But it was real. And now, as the manager stood alone in his office, the full weight of his actions hit him. His empire, built on pride, greed, and an unshakable belief in his own superiority, was collapsing. Meanwhile, outside the bank, the old man walked away with a steady pace. His steps were slow but sure, as if he had already anticipated this moment. He had known the road would be difficult, that the world would try to push back against the truth. But he wasn't here to prove anyone wrong. He was here to claim what was rightfully his, to restore a legacy that had been buried by time. He passed by the crowd of people on the street, their eyes following him with curiosity, but he paid them no mind. His thoughts were elsewhere, reflecting on the long road he had traveled to get to this point. His family's legacy had been taken from them once, but now it was being returned, piece by piece. This was more than just about the bank. It was about honoring the generations that came before him, the sacrifices they had made to build something lasting, something meaningful. But even as he walked away, he couldn't help but wonder about the manager, about the people who had scoffed and laughed at him. What would happen to them now? Would they learn from their mistakes? Or would they continue to hold on to their illusions of power and control? As he turned a corner and disappeared from view, his mind was made up. The old man wasn't interested in revenge. He wasn't here to destroy the bank. He was here to restore balance. He had never wanted to see the manager suffer, but the pride that had blinded him was now his undoing. It was a bitter lesson, one that would resonate through the walls of the bank long after the old man had left. Inside, the manager stood at the window of his office, staring out at the street below. His eyes were fixed on the empty space where the old man had walked away. He had been so certain that he could control everything, that his success was the result of his own brilliance. But now, all that seemed so hollow, the money, the power, the titles, none of it mattered. He had lost everything because he refused to recognize the truth when it was right in front of him. With a heavy sigh, the manager turned away from the window, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. He had made a critical mistake, one that could not be undone. The bank, the very institution he had worked so hard to protect, was no longer his, and now it was too late to take it back. The old man had walked into the bank that morning, a seemingly frail and forgotten figure. But by the end of the day, he had taken something far more valuable than ownership. He had taken back the truth. And in doing so, he had reclaimed not just a bank, but a piece of history that no one could ever steal again. As the day drew to a close, the bank stood quiet, its future uncertain, its legacy altered forever. And the old man walking away from it all knew one thing for sure. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from a battle fought with fists or force, but from a quiet truth that can never be erased.